Welcome to Mythos AI, your source for Cliff's Notes on complex subjects. Join Anna and Phil for yet another engaging conversation.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into something important, using the past to shed light on the present.
That's right. We're going to look at the McCarthy era, roughly 1947 to 57, and then draw some parallels or contrasts with potential developments happening right now in President Trump's second term.
We've gone through quite a bit of material historical analysis, policy blueprints like Project 2025, current reporting.
And the idea is to distill that down, to give you the core insights, the key connections.
Exactly. So our mission for you, the listener, is this. Understand how fear and loyalty demands were used back then, and what that might teach us about challenges to democratic institutions today, providing some context for April 2025.
Okay, so where do we begin? The McCarthy era. It didn't just pop up overnight.
Right. What was the background, the soil it grew in?
Well, you have to look at the world right after World War II. The Cold War is heating up fast. There's the expansion of Soviet influence in Eastern Europe, the shock of the Soviets getting the atomic bomb sooner than expected.
And events in Asia, too.
Definitely. The communist victory in China in '49, then the Korean War starting in 1950. It all created this intense global anxiety. The threat of communism felt very, very real and immediate.
So a lot of external pressure, fear from abroad. But you mentioned domestic roots, too.
Absolutely. There was already a history of anti-communism in the U.S. Think the first Red Scare after World War I, often tied up with anti-immigrant feelings, anti-labor sentiments.
And suspicion of government programs?
Yes, conservatives had long been wary of things like the New Deal. Plus, you had existing networks. J. Edgar Hoover's FBI was very active. Veterans groups, business organizations, already focused on finding supposed communist influence. They were sort of primed for this.
And this is when President Truman takes a significant step.
He does. In 1947, he issues Executive Order 9835. This set up loyalty screenings for all federal employees.
The goal being?
Officially, to find anyone tied to totalitarian, fascist, communist, or subversive groups. It was maybe partly a response to pressure, to show he was tough on communism, but it effectively institutionalized investigating people's politics.
And it created tools for that.
Yes, it established loyalty review boards and, crucially, the Attorney General's list of subversive organizations, or a GLOSO. Just being associated with a group on that list cast suspicion. And this federal model spread.
How so?
State governments, local governments, even private employers started adopting similar practices. It normalized the idea that associations could get you into trouble.
Okay, so the stage is set. Then Senator Joseph McCarthy arrives on the scene.
He really bursts into the national consciousness in February 1950. That speech in Wheeling, West Virginia.
The famous one where he claimed to have a list.
Exactly. A list of communists supposedly working in the State Department. The number changed. He never produced solid evidence, but it was explosive. It grabbed headlines and poured gasoline on the fire.
Was he building on anything that came before?
Oh, yes. He tapped into the work already being done by the House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC.
They'd been around for a while, right?
Since the late 30s, initially looking into Nazi propaganda. But by the late 40s, they'd pivoted hard towards alleged communist infiltration, especially in Hollywood, and the Hollywood 10 and government, like the Alger Hiss case.
And HUAC's methods were aggressive.
Very. Public hearings, intense questioning about political beliefs, immense pressure to name names, identify others. That became a template for McCarthy.
And then he gets his own committee chairmanship?
Right. In 1953, he takes over the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and he really ramps things up.
Targeting whom?
Government agencies, the State Department again, the Army, Voice of America libraries, but also universities, the press, anyone he suspected.
And his tactics?
Aggressive questioning bordering on harassment, often acting unilaterally, pressuring witnesses relentlessly, equating taking the Fifth Amendment, the right against self-incrimination, with guilt.
It sounds almost performative.
In many ways, it was. The goal often seemed to be public exposure, intimidation, destroying reputations, rather than careful investigation. There were even cases of, doctored evidence, like that famous altered photo.
Beyond the hearings, what other tools were used to exclude people?
Loyalty oaths became incredibly common. Truman's orders set the precedent, and they spread everywhere: state, local governments, schools, universities, even some private jobs.
And if you refused to sign?
You could be fired. Simple as that. The Weavers, the folk group, are a famous example of careers impacted by this climate, even without a formal oath refusal in their specific case. But the general suspicion,
And blacklisting.
that was huge. especially in entertainment, but also education and other fields.
Mm-hmm.
It was often informal, just networks of employers sharing lists, afraid of hiring someone deemed politically suspect.
Like red channels.
Exactly. Publications like Red Channels explicitly named people in entertainment, effectively ending their mainstream careers.
The Hollywood 10 really crystallized this, didn't they?
They did. 10 writers, directors, producers called before HUAC in '47. They refused to answer the "Are you now or have you ever been?" question, citing the First Amendment.
What happened to them?
Contempt of Congress charges, prison time for most, and then the studios issue the Waldorf Statement, formally blacklisting them. It sent a powerful message and ruined careers. Many had to work under fake names or leave the U.S. entirely.
It's unsettling how deep this went. How did major institutions react? The media, universities, government itself.
It was a mixed bag.
Yeah.
Initially, a lot of the press just amplified McCarthy's claims, maybe out of sensationalism, maybe fear.
But some pushback?
Eventually, yes.
Yeah.
Figures like the cartoonist Erblock and famously Edward R. Murrow on his show See It Now started challenging McCarthy directly, exposing his methods. That was crucial.
What about universities?
Many caved to pressure, instituting loyalty oaths. Faculty were fired for suspected communist ties or refusing to cooperate. There was much unified institutional resistance, though some individuals and local groups fought back, like some faculty at the University of California.
And within the government?
Hoover's FBI was an active player, feeding information to committees. The State Department was a prime target. But eventually, McCarthy went too far when he took on the Army.
That led to the Army-McCarthy hearing.
Exactly. And that became a turning point. There was also political resistance earlier. Senator Margaret Chase Smith's Declaration of Conscience. Truman vetoed the McCarran Act, though it was overridden. Eisenhower later invoked executive privilege against McCarthy, too.
You mentioned the McCarran Act. What were the key laws used to enforce this?
Well, there was the Smith Act from 1940. It criminalized advocating the violent overthrow of the government that was used to prosecute Communist Party leaders.
And the Supreme Court initially upheld that.
Yes, in Dennis v. United States. Then came the McCarran Act, or Internal Security Act, in 1950. It was pretty sweeping, created the Subversive Activities Control Board, required communist groups to register, restricted members' rights, even allowed for emergency detention.
Truman vetoed it, but it passed anyway.
Yes, Congress overrode his veto. But over time, the courts did start to set some limits.
How so?
Later Supreme Court cases like Yates v. U.S. narrowed the Smith Act, saying it only applied to advocating action, not just abstract ideas. Watkins v. U.S. limited HUAC's power, stressing due process and legislative purpose.
So the judiciary eventually acted as a check.
To some extent, yes. Parts of the McCarran Act were also eventually struck down as violations of the First and Fifth Amendments in cases like Albertson, Aptheker, and Rabeau. But this took time.
So while these legal tools existed, what was the day-to-day impact on ordinary people, the overall atmosphere?
It was pervasive fear. Suspicion was everywhere, far beyond the direct targets. The Red Menace propaganda was intense.
And just being accused could be devastating.
Absolutely. Job loss, social ostracism, ruined reputations, even without proof. This led to widespread self-censorship. People were afraid to speak out, join groups, even discuss certain topics. It really narrowed the space for dissent.
But McCarthyism did eventually end, or at least McCarthy's power faded. What caused the collapse?
The Army-McCarthy hearings in 1954 were absolutely pivotal. They were televised. Millions saw McCarthy's bullying tactics firsthand.
The have you no sense of decency moment.
That was Joseph Welch, the Army's counsel.
Yeah.
That line, directed at McCarthy, really hit home. It crystallized the public's growing unease. McCarthy's approval ratings plummeted after the hearings.
And the Senate acted.
Yes. Later in 1954, the Senate formally condemned or censured McCarthy for his conduct. That effectively stripped him of his power and influence, though he remained a senator until his death.
So a combination of public exposure, institutional pushback, and a formal political rebuke. What's the lasting legacy?
Well, McCarthyism itself became shorthand for character assassination and suppressing dissent through baseless accusations. The era had long-term effects. It decimated parts of the American left, arguably delayed social reforms, entrenched the Cold War mindset, fostered cultural conformity, and ironically helped expand the national security apparatus.
And it left us with this ongoing tension.
Exactly. The debate about balancing national security with civil liberties continues. The McCarthy era stands as a stark warning about how fear can undermine democratic principles.
Okay, that history is crucial context. Let's shift to the present, April 2025. President Trump is in his second term. What aspects of the current landscape seem to echo that past?
One major theme, heavily influenced by frameworks like Project 2025, seems to be a real drive for loyalty within the government workforce.
You mean like Schedule F?
Precisely. The reinstatement of Schedule F is a key mechanism. It allows for reclassifying potentially tens of thousands of career civil servants, removing their job protections, making them essentially at-will employees.
And the goal is?
The stated goal, or at least the perceived goal by critics, is to make it easier to remove employees deemed insufficiently loyal to the administration's agenda and replace them with loyalists.
What are the concerns there?
Concerns are that it could stifle internal dissent, discourage objective advice if it contradicts the political line, and potentially politicize the civil service. There's also worry, expressed by some observers, that agencies like the DOJ or FBI could be directed against perceived political opponents, even within the government itself.
And we've seen related actions.
There have been reports of dismissals of inspectors general, for example, which critics interpret as prioritizing loyalty over independent oversight.
So the different mechanism than loyalty oaths, but a similar focus on ensuring alignment.
You could draw that parallel. Schedule F is perhaps a more direct tool for personnel control within the executive branch itself, compared to the broader, sometimes vaguer, loyalty oaths of the past.
What about the relationship with the press? That's certainly been a flashpoint.
Yes, we're seeing what looks like an escalation of previous tactics. The rhetoric remains harsh fake news, enemy of the people, aimed at undermining media credibility.
Beyond rhetoric.
There's the use of legal tools, libel lawsuits against news outlets. Concerns have been raised about potential DOJ or FBI investigations, subpoenas targeting journalists. Access is also being managed.
How so?
Reports suggest critical outlets face reduced access to briefings or officials, while more favorable outlets, including some far-right platforms or even individual podcasters, are given privileged access.
And regulatory pressure.
There are accounts of pressure on the FCC, suggestions about challenging broadcast licenses, demanding raw footage. Plus, proposals outlined in Project 2025 include things like rethinking White House press arrangements and potentially defunding public media like PBS and NPR.
So it seems like a wider array of tools compared to McCarthy, who relied more on public accusations.
It appears that way. McCarthy used hearings and leaks to shape media narratives. The current approach seems to encompass legal threats, regulatory levers, access control, alongside the direct rhetoric.
Universities also seem to be in the administration's sights. What pressures are they facing?
It's coming from multiple angles. There's hostile rhetoric, labeling universities as centers of Marxism or woke ideology.
And financial pressure.
Yes. Reports mention federal research grants being frozen, reviewed, or potentially cut. There have been significant funding freezes linked to investigations, often related to issues like campus protests or alleged ideological bias, even threats to challenge their tax-exempt status.
What about what's actually taught or researched?
There's pressure on curriculum and academic freedom. Executive orders targeting diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or specific subjects like critical race theory. Federal probes into faculty speech have been reported. Pressure on research priorities, crackdowns on student protests, including visa revocations for international students.
And Project 2025 has specific plans here too.
Yes, proposals include reducing federal education funding overall and potentially intervening in accreditation, which could exert significant control. It's a mix of financial leverage and ideological pressure.
How does the information environment itself, particularly social media, compare to the McCarthy era's landscape?
It's fundamentally different. Back then, information flowed mainly through newspapers, radio, early TV. Now, social media is dominant for many.
And the administration uses it directly.
Platforms like Truth Social allow direct communication to supporters, bypassing traditional media filters and fact-checking. Disinformation strategies are also a major factor, demonizing opponents, amplifying certain narratives, creating feedback loops.
And efforts to counter disinformation.
Reports indicate the administration has moved to dismantle some government counter-disinformation programs, which aligns with proposals in Project 2025.
Plus the technology itself.
Right. Social media algorithms can inherently amplify inflammatory content, and the rise of AI deepfakes adds another layer of potential manipulation that simply didn't exist before. It's a much faster, more fragmented, and potentially more easily manipulated information space than in the 1950s.
Given all these pressures, Schedule F, media intimidation, university funding threats, what about institutional silence or even complicity? Are we seeing signs of that?
There are certainly reports suggesting a growing climate of fear. Fear of reprisal being fired under Schedule F, Facing lawsuits, losing funding, being investigated can create powerful incentives for individuals and institutions not to speak out.
Weakening checks and balances.
That's a major concern raised by critics regarding Project 2025's focus on consolidating power under the presidency. If Congress or the judiciary are perceived as less willing or able to push back, the executive branch has more room to maneuver.
Are there tangible signs of this chilling effect?
Anecdotally, yes. Reports of fewer government officials willing to talk to the press, even off the record. Instances where universities or media outlets might seem to be self-censoring or complying with demands to avoid conflict.
It highlights how reliant some norms are on self-restraint.
Exactly. When that self-restraint diminishes, the norms themselves can erode, potentially normalizing actions that were previously considered out of bounds.
Okay, let's draw some direct comparisons. We've touched on this, but looking at the core political strategy of using fear, what are the biggest similarities between the McCarthy era and now?
The fundamental similarity is the creation of an us versus them dynamic, identifying an internal enemy. For McCarthy, it was primarily communists and sympathizers.
And now?
The target seemed broader, more diffuse. The deep state, critical media, academics, political opponents, those associated with woke ideas. It's less about a specific foreign-linked ideology and more about domestic political and cultural opposition.
But the tactics of enforcement are similar.
In principle, yes. Enforcing loyalty oaths, then Schedule F now, identifying enemies. Using blacklisting or exclusion tactics, formal blacklists then, perhaps exclusion through firings, funding cuts, or denial of access now. The core strategy involves leveraging fear of the other to demand conformity and sideline dissent.
Yet the tools themselves have evolved significantly.
Definitely. McCarthy relied heavily on congressional powers, subpoenas, hearings, contempt charges, plus leveraging laws like the Smith Act. Today, the emphasis seems much more on executive power. Executive orders, regulatory agencies, control over funding, personnel decisions via Schedule F, legal actions initiated by the executive branch, and direct communication via social media.
A shift from legislative investigative tools to more direct executive action and digital methods.
That seems to be a key difference in the how.
And the justifications given have also shifted.
Yes. McCarthyism was framed almost entirely around the existential threat of communism and national security in the Cold War. Today's justifications are more varied, fighting corruption, draining the swamp, restoring national greatness, pushing back against perceived cultural decay or wokeism. The definition of the threat has broadened.
How institutions are pressured also looks different.
McCarthy applied pressure often through public shaming via hearings, creating a climate where private institutions felt compelled to act. The current approach seems to involve more direct coercion from the executive branch itself, using the purse strings, regulatory power, legal threats, personnel changes, potentially allowing for faster, more targeted pressure.
This comparison really brings the concept of the chilling effect into focus. How does that play out in both eras regarding democratic fragility?
In both cases, the fear of consequences leads people and institutions to hesitate, to self-censor. During McCarthyism, it was fear of association, being blacklisted. Today, it might be fear of direct state action lawsuits, funding cuts, job loss under Schedule F.
So lawyers, journalists, academics feel the pressure in both periods.
Yes, but the source of the pressure feels different. Less diffuse social pressure, perhaps, and more potential for direct government action today. This normalization of self-censorship is a real danger in both contexts.
What about performative aspects? McCarthy's hearings were very theatrical.
True. And some might argue that the unpredictable nature of, say, social media pronouncements or sudden policy shifts today serves a similar function, keeping opponents off balance, dominating the news cycle, making governance feel somewhat performative or driven by spectacle.
Let's talk legal and constitutional dimensions. How do the threats to fundamental rights compare?
The First Amendment is central in both. McCarthyism attacked freedom of association and political speech. Today, the pressure points seem focused on freedom of the press, academic freedom, and critical speech more broadly.
And the weaponization of government.
It's a core concern in both. Then it was congressional committees, the FBI, repressive laws. Now, the concern focuses more on executive agencies, DOJ, FCC, IRS personnel policy like Schedule F, and the use of federal funding as leverage.
What about the role of the courts?
That's a crucial difference, or perhaps an unknown. The courts eventually provided checks on McCarthyism, albeit slowly. Today, with the judiciary significantly reshaped over recent years, and with arguments for expansive executive power being advanced, the extent to which the courts will serve as a bulwark is less certain.
Finally, let's consider resistance. How did resistance work against McCarthy, and what does it look like now?
McCarthy's decline involved several factors. Media pushback like Murrow's, the army resisting his investigations, the televised hearings exposing his tactics, the Senate censure, Eisenhower's actions, and later court decisions. Individual courage played a role, too.
And resistance today, what forms does it take?
We see it from civil society groups, investigative reporting, whistleblowers, though the risks for them seem incredibly high, state governments sometimes pushing back, parts of academia, maybe international pressure, strategies involve lawsuits, reporting, public mobilization.
But are the challenges different?
I think so. McCarthy operated in a less fragmented media landscape and eventually overreached quite publicly. The current administration faces a polarized public, utilizes disinformation effectively, and actively attacks the legitimacy of potential checks like the press or the judiciary. Resistance might be harder when the institutions meant to enable it are themselves under attack or delegitimized in the eyes of many.
It seems the approach today is maybe more systematic, targeting the structures themselves.
That's a key concern raised by observers, that Project 2025 and related efforts represent a more comprehensive plan to reshape the government and sideline opposition, potentially making resistance more difficult than countering one individual's excesses.
This has been incredibly insightful, mapping these historical echoes onto our current moment. It really underscores how fragile democratic norms can be when faced with concerted pressure based on fear and loyalty demands. Thank you for walking us through that.
Thanks for listening to Mythos AI. Stay tuned for more concise insights. And remember to hit the like button and subscribe for future episodes.